let me use this rather complicated drawing to actually show you how easy perspective can be to understand without all the jargon. The first thing to appreciate, forget about little boxes on planes and vanishing points and all of that. The important thing to remember is that perspective is really a way of explaining how things get smaller as they move further away. Now, that's pretty obvious. That's the heart of perspective. Things get smaller as they move further away. Now, we're looking at this building here, and so part of the building is closer. That corner with the square column on it on the left is closer to us than the other end of the building. And so the building is going to become smaller as it moves down along the street because it's getting further away. Now, if we were looking straight onto the building and there was another one a bit further away that we were also looking straight onto, the whole building would look the same, but just smaller. But because we're looking at this building angled on, part of the same building is closer and therefore larger, and part of the same building is further away and is smaller. And the building has to shrink, and that's why we get these diagonal lines. They're representing the fact that the columns at the far end of this building look smaller than the same columns that in life are the same size that are closer. And if we compare this squared column on the left corner there, just behind that post of that large stone post of the railing, and we compare it with the end one that we know is the same size, we can see the end one is a lot smaller. But things get smaller in two directions. They get smaller in their height, and we can see that really obviously. That furthest column on the right-hand side is a lot shorter than the one on the left-hand side. But things also get shorter in their width. And if we look at the column on the left-hand corner, we can see that it looks a lot wider if we were to measure it, with what we can see of the square column further along, it's a lot narrower. If we were just to measure it, the proportions are pretty much the same, but if we were to measure the width and the height, the closest of these square columns is a lot higher and wider. As it gets further away, it gets smaller. Now, I'm labouring this point because it just seems almost too simple to be true, too obvious, but it's this fact that creates the perspective angles and the foreshortening effect. So the perspective angles, the fact that as these lines move upwards, they slope at a greater and greater angle in both directions, that's what happens regarding verticality, regarding height issues of a building. And so, as I said in the opening, the fact that the furthest column appears to be smaller and the closest one appears to be taller means when we join those up, the lines are not going to be horizontal, but they're going to angle. And the key thing, the one important thing that perhaps is a bit technical with perspective, that anchors all of it, is eye level. That's the level of our eye when we're looking at this, or the level of the camera, because that's where we don't get an angle, but we actually get a horizontal line. Now, in a given scene, of course, there may not actually be a horizontal line, but if we look at the top of the railing, we can see that from left to right, this line angles upwards. If we look at the top of those ground floor columns, we can see that the line of the entablature above them goes from left to right downwards, so they angle in different directions. That tells us that eye level is somewhere in between. So, if we have a look at the detail on the wall, we can see there are some horizontal lines that are decorative, but I think they're meant, or they may well reflect the actual stonework. And we can see that as we come down from the top of the columns, those lines are angling if we join them up. Pretend the columns in front of them aren't there. And if we join them up, we can see that they angle less and less, and that they're actually getting very close to being horizontal. In fact, the last one that we can see is pretty much horizontal. And what that says, maybe even the one, no, not the one above it, and that says that that's approximately where eye level is. That's approximately the level of the camera when I took this. So that's the way perspective is affected, height ways. And that fact that the things further away are shorter means that the horizontal joining lines angle, except at where our eye level is. And as things are higher above our eye level, the angle increases. So if you look at that angle at the very top of the building, it's a much steeper angle than the angle, say, at the top of the columns. If we go the other direction, we go below that approximate eye level we've worked out, we can see with the rail, the top of the rail, it angles the other way. But if we go to the bottom of the railing, or where the metal hits the concrete support that it's in, we can see that it's a greater angle because it's also moving further from eye level, but in the other direction. And I think of this as the fan pattern. Where we have eye level, we have a straight line, and above that, the ribs of the fan move in one direction and the ribs of the fan move in the other direction. And we don't necessarily have an equal number of ribs in each direction. In many cases, particularly street level, we have more upwards than downwards. But if I was standing, say, on the first floor of the building across the road, it might work the other way. There might be more horizontal lines below me that create the angles increasing in the other direction. So that's the first way that things getting smaller are affected by the distance they are from us when we look at something such as a building at an angle. Now, and that's often what people think of when we think of perspective, those angles. And really, if we're drawing from a photo or from life, the important thing is to observe these angles carefully and then realize that every angle has to be slightly greater than the one beneath it if we're moving above eye level, or the same, but in the other direction if we're moving below eye level. So these angles are never parallel. They're never parallel. It's tempting, particularly as they get a bit higher, just to start to make them parallel. But as I said, you compare that top angle that we see with the angle above the columns and just see how much greater it is. And these are the angles that give a lot of drama, I think, what I think of as visual dramas to our drawings. And if we don't put them in, if we don't have the self-control to draw the line at that angle, even though it feels like it's not going to look real, then we'll end up with drawings that don't look quite real and that don't have as much impact visually as they might have had. But perspective isn't just these angled horizontal lines, because when something gets smaller, moving away, as I said at the start, it gets narrower. And it's not just the objects that get narrower, but it's the gaps between the objects that get narrower as well. So it's not just that these columns get narrower, but the space between the columns is narrower. And if the space between objects is equal, if we were to look straight on at a building, if the space between the columns is equal, then the space between the columns will get narrower at a faster and faster rate as it moves along the side of the building, the facade of the building. And so, again, how we work this is by observation on our reference first, and then with our drawing. Now, I'm going to refer to the drawing a lot more in a moment, but I wanted to get these two very, I think you'll agree, straightforward principles in mind. The overall principle, something gets further away, it gets smaller, and then thinking of it in two parts. The vertical, getting further away, things get shorter, therefore, in our drawing than in from the parts that are closer. And that's the side of perspective that affects these horizontal angles that slope more and more as they move above the level of the eyes. But secondly is what we call foreshortening in perspective, which is more the horizontal, the gap or the width that we have with different elements. And let me just say, perspective doesn't just affect buildings, it affects everything. But because buildings are so large and so geometric, it's more obvious with buildings. And therefore, if we get it wrong, it's going to be more obvious. But just for a start, look at this, look at the rail in my reference. So this rail is the same size, but part of the rail is very close to us. In fact, it's the closest part of this scene, this street scene, which is in the Australian city of Hobart. And the rail down the far end is also exactly the same. Now, if I were to measure one of the rails, one of the posts that I have closest, and measure the height of the furthest one, it's going to be a lot shorter further down the end, like considerably, maybe a third or less, maybe even a quarter as high. And that's the effect of something being further away. But if we look at the spaces between the rails, we can see that even if we just look in this first section, which is closer and therefore it's easier for us to see, we can see the gap gets narrower and narrower. In fact, closer to us, the gap is wider than the rails. But when we get to the far end of just this first section, the gap actually is thinner than the actual width of the rails, even though the width of the rails is narrowing as well. These are the things that's really important to notice in our observation. And if we move to the next section, within a very few number of rails, the gap actually disappears. We don't see it. And what we see is, in effect, a continuous line of ironwork. And when we go to the third section, it's definitely that. We actually don't see any gaps. The light on an edge appears to create possibly the effect of there's light and dark, and therefore we're thinking gaps. But actually that's the light on the metal. We don't see between any of those rails further down. So when we draw, if we want to capture a realistic effect, we want to have observed the way these rails narrow and then work out, now what's the best way for me to capture that when I draw. Now you can see here just my holding the angle, how I try and get my angles correct for not every line, but for the main ones, is I observe carefully. I put a dot on my paper where I think that horizontal line is going to angle down to. And I just do that from observation most of the time. But then I check it with my pen, like this, from the part of the drawing I've done with the dot I've put, and then I slide it across onto my reference. Now, if I'm drawing on location, I can't slide it across to my photo, but it works the same way if I hold it up in front of me and then just bring it straight down. And it doesn't sound like it's going to be very accurate, but it actually is. Please hit the like button if you're finding this helpful. And can I suggest, oh, not suggest, but can I say that you're watching this very close to real time. This is sped up 1/4 as much again. So it's almost real time. It just reduced it from basically 40 to 30 minutes by reducing the speed by 1/4. And you'll see what I did there, because this was a fairly long line to draw and I wanted to get it fairly accurate. So I did some dots and I'm taking it slowly, and I'm hoping that helps me to be accurate. What I would also do if I weren't recording this is I would rotate the paper so that the angle for me was actually going from lower left up to upper right, because that's my sweet spot personally for drawing straight lines. It's easiest for me to get a straight line, being right-handed, in that direction. But because I'm recording, I can't do that, so I have to try and cope with drawing some lines at a slightly awkward angle for how and where I hold the pen and my drawing setup. Particularly with curves, that can be an important thing as well. So now I'm drawing this facade, and notice how I don't draw the line just straight through these railings. Would have been tempting, but I think I create more of an effect that we're looking through a railing by doing it this way. But in the end, you can observe what I do and the effect it creates and decide whether it gives a more realistic feel or not. And use whatever you think will work best for you. in your drawings for how you want your drawings to look. There is no right way to draw. There's just the way to draw that creates the drawings that, as best as I can manage, other sorts of drawings I want to produce. And that can change over time, and therefore how we draw can change over time. I don't draw the same way I was drawing 2 or 3 years ago, because I've changed in my mind as I've become more aware of the possibilities of drawing. I demand more in some ways of my drawings. And I've had to work out ways of getting there, creating the techniques or creating the effect at the end that I can see in my mind now. So now we're moving across, we're moving down the front of the building. And I think the really important thing, this is the key thing in my mind for drawing, for shortening, for capturing this effect, and that is, do not be distracted by the fact that I can see that this building is sloping away, and that the visually most attention-grabbing lines are the diagonals. What I need to do is to see the horizontal gap between things and not get distracted by the detail that might be between the things. So if I'm looking at these columns, which are the main elements to put in place, the gap generally is getting narrower. Now, there isn't an equal gap between all of these, so I have to allow for that. And this is where simple, careful observation comes in. But when I look at the gap between, we've got this, if we look at that squared column on the left front corner, I've got that, and then I've got a round column that overlaps it visually. If I looked from the front, there would be a gap between them, but from this angle, they overlap. Then I have a gap, and then I've got the same thing mirrored symmetrically. I've got the same thing on the other side. So I look at the columns that I've drawn first, the closest ones, the ones where that black line is on the corner. And then I look at the gap, and I think to myself, well, the gap is less than the width of those two columns together. It's quite a lot less. And I use that to help me position now the, if you like, third column along, the rounded column that has a square column on the other side. And then I put those in place. And now I have another gap. And I'm thinking, well, this gap now has to be narrower than the first gap I've done because it is narrower. But I always look at the horizontal line as if there were just a horizontal line. I don't let my eye go along the diagonal because a diagonal line is longer than a horizontal one in any given space. And so if I'm unduly influenced by the diagonal lines that are in the architecture, I found personally they kept misleading me rather, to make that gap too long. And I found doing a horizontal line first in my head helped me then get better proportions. In fact, I'm surprised I haven't done it here, but I usually actually draw a horizontal line on the reference if I'm drawing the same size as I am here, just to help me focus on what this width is without the distraction of other lines that aren't the width that I want. And as the columns move further along, the width narrows and narrows, and we can see that if we look at that furthest pair of columns where we have a square column and a round column, and then a round column and a square column, which is on the end, so that this sort of double grouping on the left side is repeated on the right side, a little bit obscured by that sign, we can see just how narrow those last two lines are going to be where we see the square column. They're so close together, it's actually hard to draw. In fact, it's a thinner distance if we just look horizontally of the width of that final end square column. It's narrower than the thickness of the lamp post. So that's pretty amazing. That's how much things narrow. The other thing, as I move along, is that before I start doing all of these foreshortened gaps and columns, so we're drawing just as much, we're drawing just as much by drawing the gaps as we are drawing the columns. I think that's another key way of thinking. I'm not drawing just the columns. I draw the gaps as well. And if I draw the gap, And I focus as much on the proportions of the gap as much as on the shapes, the columns. And that's called drawing through negative space. It's by drawing, completing an overall drawing by drawing the spaces between things accurately, as well as seeking to draw the things themselves. So I'm thinking both ways, the columns and the gaps. But what I also do is I look at the overall length of the building, or rather the overall width of that length, that front facade on my drawing. Now, this is where I've put tape around here because that's where I want my drawing to end, and I want all my lines to sort of end in a neat row. But another handy thing this does when we're drawing the same size is I can see the width between the end of this building and the right-hand side on my reference. And if I go to my tape on the right-hand side, I can see that, well, if I get this in proportion, it's going to be, that distance from the edge. And so I can put a dot there. I can put a little mark to sort of say, when I've placed all of these columns going across the page, getting smaller and narrower, then it should all finish here. It shouldn't finish too soon, and it shouldn't finish past that. And so this gives me another reference point. And can you see that once I've got these columns in place, I need to put the detail into place, but that it's much easier to do that having just seen the gaps between the columns as gaps at the start, and that once I've put the columns as best I can in the right location with the right distances and the right height, now I know how small I have to draw the detail, the proportions for the detail. So this is actually also a demo of how to draw freehand in ink. There are no pencil marks on this page. This is just drawn directly in ink through eyeballing the reference. And I began developing this sort of way of drawing because I wanted to do some location sketching freehand in ink. And I haven't really done that much of that as it turns out for different reasons, but I have found it's a really enjoyable way to learn to draw because we can't get too precious. And the other reason I began to draw freehand in ink is because I found that when I was doing my pencil under drawings, ironically, the better I became at drawing, the more demanding I became that everything had to be perfect. And I felt like I was spending more time erasing lines than I was drawing lines that were still there at the end. And I thought, well, if I don't have any option of erasing, then I just have to keep pushing forwards rather than throwing my drawing into reverse all the time and going backwards. And I think for me, it was probably the best drawing decision I've ever made. So if you have a bit of a struggle with perfectionism, if you find you get a bit paralyzed at some sort of fear of making mistakes, then let me just encourage you giving this a go, because what I've learned is that mistakes aren't nearly as bad as you think when you make them, that they're part of the overall process of a drawing, and when you've put a mark on the paper that's not quite right, it guides you to placing the next mark over the top of it that will be correct or more correct, or have far more chance to be far more easily put on the paper correct. You can see what I've actually walked around to the side of the table now so that this line is in my sweet spot, and see how much smoother it was. So I was actually drawing that line then from left to right upwards. And it just shows the difference that when we know our sweet spot and use it, let's hope this one works reasonably well. Yep. And what you can see is that all of these long diagonal shapes are wedges, and that's because the angle keeps increasing on whatever side is closest to us. And so now, having established all of this, it becomes quite straightforward in lots of ways. I only have one more, if you like, tricky part to do, and that's to work out the upper diagonal angles. But all of the columns that I have above me now to draw, I can just position them, or as I think of it, align them with what I've already drawn. Because when I look at the reference, I can see that all of the upper columns line up with lower columns. So if you were to look straight on at the building, they're above each other. So I've got the lower columns, and I spent quite a bit of time working hard at getting them correctly positioned. So now I can just piggyback off that effort and put the upper ones right over the top of them, and that should place them in the right position. But I do have to work out exactly how high these columns go as they move further away. And again, if we look at the if you like, one of those two middle columns that aren't paired up, the closest one, we don't see the top of it. It's tall enough to be off the page. But when we go further along, we can see that the furthest ones are significantly smaller, shorter rather, in terms of what we see if we were to measure the height with a ruler, and yet we see all of that column. We see the capital as well, and we see the entablature above. So for shortening at work, and I'm doing the same thing with these little brackets that are holding up, well, they're not really holding up, I don't think. I think they're decoration, the overhanging cornice. And again, I'm positioning those with the columns that I have underneath. I'm also paying attention to notice that they don't go all the way along, but in fact they're centered over the columns and over the entrance section. And in the center, there is just one of these brackets over the column. Actually, no, I suspect they're, like decoratively, they're also centered under the balustrade. So we have a balustraded section creating the effect of a balcony and quite possibly the reality of a balcony, or it may just be decorative. In fact, that it may be just a window made to look like a door that doesn't really open, or it may be a spot you can stand on. I can't remember. And I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen, Copic multiliner, doing this. Now, here's a little tip that you don't often hear talked about with perspective, because very often, well, not very often, but always when you see those little perspective videos with the box on the flat plane and the horizon or horizon line, which is another word for eye level, but I prefer eye level because it tells us what it is. And sometimes what looks like the horizon in a given scene isn't the actual horizon line. So I find its eye level is more direct and less misleading. But one of the things they don't make a big fuss about is the fact that the bottom of the building is on a flat line, is on a 180-degree horizontal plane. And of course, we don't have to walk down many streets to know that most streets slightly slope up or down. And if we look at this street, we can actually see that as it moves away from us, it's actually sloping down. If we look at the concrete base that bottom rail section is on, we can see that there's a height at the far end that's not there at the top end of that third section. Now that tells me that the ground is sloping. And so what I need to remember is that all of these perspective angles and this fan-shaped pattern that I talked about earlier only applies if the horizontal lines are parallel to each other. And this sloping ground is not parallel now to all the other horizontal lines, and therefore it doesn't fit the pattern. And that's why, if you like, that grey concrete section, or I think it's actually stone section down the far end, looks like a wedge that's going in the opposite direction to all the other wedges, every other wedge in this. And that's because they're not parallel lines. The ground is not parallel to the top of that stonework, but it's sloping down. And when that happens, we simply observe carefully what we see and do that. And can I also point out, and this is something I really didn't realise for a long time, and I couldn't believe it when I realised it, but that's that downhill sloping line, when I draw it on my paper, actually goes uphill. So, yep, that's a bit of a surprise for me. So how are we going? This last section falls into place pretty quickly. So I hope this way of thinking of perspective, if you struggle with perspective at all, as simply a way of describing how things get smaller as they move further away, and the general visual principles that creates is for anyone who's struggled with understanding the more technical diagrams and applying them to life, makes it easier. It's just things getting smaller as they move further away. And the key is being aware of that, to observe our reference or what's in front of us really carefully and then draw what we see. But it's easier to see clearly if we understand what we're looking for. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Sorry, I missed video in the last couple of minutes of this, but I think you get the point. Although it looks a complex scene, it's not that hard if we understand what we're doing and just go bit by bit. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, and whatever your understanding versus observation is, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.